Finn Stevenson, welcome to Chewing It Over. What is AI physiotherapy?
Thanks, Jack. Great to be here. So AI is a technology. It's obviously a technology that a lot of people are talking about at the moment and that there's a lot of excitement about. Fundamentally for us, it's part of what is allowing us to deliver much more scalable MSK physiotherapy care, which is ultimately what we're about. So, the goal of Flok is to be able to try and close this sort of supply-demand gap in the delivery of clinical care. If everything we do clinically is bottlenecked by the number of clinicians available, clearly with demand in MSK as it is and growing as it is, that puts some fairly significant constraints on the type of care, the access to care, the volume of care that patients are able to have. AI for us is part of what allows us to kind of close that gap, deliver really, really high quality care without waiting lists, without limits on kind of volume, and also actually free up face-to-face, more traditional care capacity for the sorts of encounters and patients that will benefit most from that.
Hello everybody, Jim here from the Physio Matters team. Apologies to interrupt your regular scheduled programming, but if you look at the QR code up here or click on the links associated with this video, you will see we've got a webinar with Jane Ashbrook on the uncertainty of getting it right in shoulders, and this is through Physio Matters Advanced Practice. Subscribers to PMAP get this absolutely free, or it's £18, so just find the links and subscribe, and we will see you on the webinar.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things I'd love to share with our audience, some will have heard of you, all sorts of reasons, and we're going to get into some of your exposure in the national media included. But can you give me a clue as to your background and your story, as well as then what inspired Flok and its story?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is clinical. I studied medicine. I did MSK medicine, specifically postgrad, with a specific interest in spinal deformity. So clinical background. I've then been in health tech and med tech for about the last 10 years. In between the two, I had a sort of unusual detour through full-time sport. So I was on a full-time rowing program, part of the sort of GB development program, looking towards the Olympics.
For those that haven't met Finn, he's even taller than me, right? He's at least.
Yeah, you can't. Everyone looks short on a webcam, but yeah, I'm about 6'7", and like kind of most people who are 6'7" and have bad posture had plenty of back pain, especially while I was rowing. And I think for me, it was this very stark realization of, obviously in a professional sport environment, you are in a sort of resource unconstrained setting. You have, for a pretty small group of you, a full-time, medical team, including physio, which actually is the sort of prime, that's probably the most major component of your kind of medical support team in that sort of sport. And so, we all had plenty of MSK pain while we were training and racing, but you'd see the physio the same day, you'd see them every day, and you'd be racing again a week later. And for me, when I then left rowing and went into med tech and had a sort of much more normal existence and was suddenly back in kind of normal healthcare, I actually, my back flared up again, and I really struggled to get on top of it. And I was, it took me quite a while actually. And I was thinking, I think for me that was quite striking in that, got the clinical background, so in theory, kind of, should understand this stuff reasonably well. I'd had a few years of kind of full-time professional support with it. Actually then accessing the sort of care that I needed was surprisingly difficult. And I think for me, it drove home that a lot of the challenges in MSK delivery are not that we don't know how to manage these things. It's fundamentally an access problem. These conditions are extremely common. They tend to recur or happen over long periods of time. They're very prevalent in the population, and therefore lots of people need help with them. And that's very difficult. It's a very difficult model of care to deliver if you're going to fully depend on clinicians' kind of one-to-one interactions with patients. You will always be limited on the sort of care you can deliver, the way you can deliver it, and how effective it can be. Right. So what we set out to do with Flok is to rethink a new form of delivery model, to sit alongside traditional physiotherapy delivery, but to say, actually, could we fully automate or almost fully automate end-to-end treatment and management for for a chunk of the volume that is flowing through these kind of very high demand NHS MSK services, what would that need to look like? And I think, we started the company in 2022, so 4 years ago now. And at the time, AI was kind of just hitting this like real takeoff trajectory where we could see, over the next few years, what's going to be technologically possible will fundamentally change what is possible to do in terms of how you deliver a service. Like, this is not something, this is not a company you could have built 6, 7, 8 years ago. The capability just wasn't there. And so I think we saw this potential to do sort of fully joined up end-to-end care delivery where you were much less dependent on the sort of amount of human time in that pathway, and separate the quality of the care that you can deliver from the amount of human resource available. So I think for me, that's probably my that will be my North Star for my sort of entire career is, I think if you look at healthcare delivery, historically, every healthcare model we have ever had as a civilization is a trade-off between volume and quality. Like, the more people you need to treat, the more compromises you have to accept in the care that you deliver. And like, that has been baked into every healthcare system that's ever existed. And, we see it pretty stark in much of the NHS today. If you then, go to the private sector, for example, where you have lower volume and can therefore make some different decisions around, quality on things like wait time and frequency and the types of therapy that are available. The thing that got us extremely excited and that we started the company to do and continue to kind of constantly strive towards is, I think, AI specifically as a technology is an opportunity to break that trade-off and say, actually, it doesn't need to be kind of, volume at the expense of quality and vice versa. If you can make the gold standard more autonomous and more scalable, you can say, well, actually everyone, regardless of volume, regardless of the level of demand, can have the best possible care. And then actually go beyond that. I think that the real thing with AI is like volume actually increases quality. The more people you put through, the more patients go through a service like ours, the better that service becomes, because it
refines and trains. And,
exactly. Yeah. So you go from this, historical world in healthcare where actually the more people you have to treat in a given year for a given condition, the harder it is to do that at the level that all clinicians go into practice wanting to do, which is best possible care. And then you have to start accepting all these trade-offs. AI, I think, can help us move towards actually that becoming more of a flywheel. The higher the demand in a service, the higher the quality of the service, which will actually increase utilization of the service because it gets better and it's more attractive and more people use it. That further increases quality. And I think that will then, ultimately unlock, that ultimately is I think a sort of flywheel effect that will just drive better and better care.
Gotcha.
Now, the company. Yeah.
I definitely look forward to, and I'm really reluctantly not dragging myself that way now, because I want to talk a bit about those trade-offs, and I want to talk a little bit about even the politics, the human resource element of that, as well as the reasons as to why people can be a little startled by some of what you're saying there. However, before we rush too far ahead of that, can you tell us a bit about Flok, and especially if you can then explain how it works, because that was a really fascinating part of our off-air conversations historically, have been for me to understand better as to what the product is and how it behaves at the user interface.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing I want to really clarify here is the way to think of us is as a service, not a product. So as a company, we are a clinical service. We're a CQC approved MSK provider. Where we contract with the NHS, we're not contracting to give them a piece of technology, license them some technology, and they use that. We contract with them as a clinical partner, where we take on full responsibility for the end-to-end management of patients in our care. So we're a fully licensed healthcare provider in the UK. We deliver most of that care with our tech platform and product platform, which I'll talk you through how it works. But we obviously also do employ a team of clinicians. So we've got our whole team is based in Cambridge. So we've got a physio team here as well, who support patients remotely through their care pathway. So it's a hybrid AI and kind of traditional human telehealth service. The way the product itself works is, if you kind of step back and think about what do you need to do if you're going to deliver autonomous healthcare. for me, there are fundamentally sort of two high-level product and engineering requirements. You need to be able to automate the decision execution. This is sort of the root of clinical reasoning, is like, okay, based on the information I have, what more information do I need, and what am I going to do with the information? That's a sort of continuous reasoning process that runs. You need some way of automating that sort of clinical reasoning so that you can ask the right questions to a patient, make the right decisions, prescribe the right interventions. That's the decision-making component. If you're actually going to deliver a full care pathway, you need the other half of the coin, which is the interaction model. So, okay, fine, you're now able to execute decisions, but how do you interface with a patient in a way that is engaging, builds rapport, builds trust, builds credibility, takes them on that journey of what can be multiple months of care delivery, where this is their care pathway and their healthcare experience. And so we've built two different, very novel pieces of technology to solve both halves of that coin, and that's what we deliver today. So I can talk you through the tech level for each side. So on the decision automation side, really crucial. This is not a kind of large language model with a bit of a wrapper on top. That sort of approach to decision automation, it's very flexible, as I think everyone's increasingly familiar with. You can have kind of remarkably wide-ranging conversations with something like ChatGPT. The problem is obviously it is inconsistent, unpredictable, and probabilistic. And hallucination is not an unfortunate side effect. It's actually intrinsic part of how those systems work, and that's
because
fine
of
if
the
you
breadth,
use.
Right? So it's
Yeah.
when they're having to pull from such breadth, it's inevitable that is going to find itself more muddled and can convince itself otherwise, compared to a smaller constrained variable. Have I understood that right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's probably even deeper than that, in that an LLM has no concept of correctness. It does not. It is recreating patterns. It is not trying to. They don't. The idea of, does an LLM know whether if you were to ask the question, does an LLM know whether this is correct or not? That's a sort of flawed question. Correctness is not a fundamental of how those kinds of systems work. And that's fine for most consumer uses, and they're great systems. It's obviously not fine if you're going to use it to deliver, or not fine in that state if you're going to use it to deliver healthcare, where actually the correctness, the consistency, the accuracy, the interpretability, all of that is extremely important. So we built a very different approach to decision automation that actually went right back to. In healthcare, the key question is, how do you control behavior of a software system? You need to be much more confident than you would be in other domains that the software will behave as you expect it to, and as you have designed it to, and that you won't have this unpredictability.
So you am I right in understanding, as part of that, you would build in heuristics whereby there are more definitive rights and wrongs, right? It's not allowing itself to be more relativistic. So, should I hop up and down on this fracture? It's going to be not giving it the classic ChatGPT and say, well, what do you fancy? It's
how do you feel? Exactly.
It can't help
even
but
deeper. Yeah, it's even deeper. I actually think doing that alone is insufficient, because you would never cover the full breadth. It's impossible. It's so broad. And so what we actually did was say, if you're interested in controlling a system, you have to control the language it's created in. So I only speak English. I can only describe concepts that are expressible in the English language, and software is the same. Ultimately, what a software system is capable of doing, quite a lot of it is constrained by the language that software is created in. So what we did was build a new form of programming language specifically for clinical reasoning, and so. That's basically taking clinical reasoning, breaking it down into fundamentals, building language primitives around those, and then building up a domain-specific language that can execute in an autonomous way those sorts of decisions. Because again, the sorts of reasoning processes we make clinically are not, they're quite different from the sorts of decisions a computer would normally execute. It's not as binary, yes, no. It's the importance of a symptom will depend on its coexistence or lack of coexistence with something else. It's onset and the temporal relationship between its onset and something else, the trajectory since onset, all of these things feed together into what is a sort of messier picture. And so we built a new language, created the system, and that means the behavioral constraint is baked into the system with mathematical guarantee. So we're not saying probabilistically this should be fine. We're saying mathematically we can prove that these key safety constraints, these key things that you would never want it to be able to do, it cannot mathematically do those things. Like, it is not possible to make a piece of software in this language do that dangerous thing. And that gives us a huge amount of control. So that's how we built and then we train it on rules. So it's trained like you would teach a person. And the analogy I normally use for this is, if you were thinking about teaching a clinician to be a clinician, you would never, when people think about decision automation, it's typically, one end of the spectrum, you've got decision trees, which is you can kind of draw out a diagram, if X, then Y.
Algorithms and flowcharts.
Yeah. And you'd never be able to, if you try to imagine teaching a person to be a clinician like that, it is impossible in a space.
Folk and companies have tried, and
plenty of people have tried.
Found my ire, but yeah, no, you're right. That's not sensible clinical research.
It's you cannot describe. It's too broad. It's too organic. It's too human to describe every scenario that a clinician could possibly find themselves in and draw it out. And even if you could draw it, you couldn't evaluate it. It would take you a lifetime just to read it. So that's kind of just doesn't work if you want to go beyond like basic. I mean, people have obviously done that for sort of basic triage systems where you're sort of just categorizing patients on, high, medium, low risk, and then someone comes in and does the rest. But the other end of the spectrum, you've got the LLM, which is, throw a huge amount of unstructured data at a system, and it will kind of, recreate patterns that it's identified in that tokenized mass. And again, you'd never try and teach a human by just saying, here's all the medical information that ever existed. You're now a clinician. Congratulations. The way you teach a person is you give them rules and relationships between the rules. And, you'd say like, this is how this domain works. This is the information that's important. This is how these things interact. And so that's how we have trained our system is it's rule-based, and those rules are written and tested by our clinicians. And are pulling from the evidence base.
On that, sorry to interrupt, but crucially, those models, including when embodied in an organic matter and an inorganic matter, is that they need appropriate feedback loops based on successful outcome. So when you're training, what are you using to account for a successful intervention? Like what is it you feel meets a threshold in which that then feeds a positive versus negative feedback loop for it to be trained on, which I know you can do at rapid pace. But if you got that wrong, it means that the errors compound or the issues.
Exactly.
If you
get drift in AI terms where you're sort of drifting towards negative. So the first thing to be clear on is we're not reinventing the therapy itself. We're not delivering interventions that are new. We're just delivering the interventions that are known to work in a different way. So that's the first key thing to take. What we've done is basically look at the evidence base and say, what is the best evidence, the best evidence gold standards of care in these areas? What are the interventions that are most shown to work? How do we deliver those at more scale? In terms of the testing, the crucial thing there is you can't, that kind of feedback loop is obviously a super exciting thing in AI that you can get better and better. It's really important to us, you shouldn't be doing that in a live patient environment because it introduces unpredictability and drift. So how we approached it was our initial system development. We've got an additional system that we built that, for example, when we look at kind of triage development and triage specificity, we built an additional system that generates several thousand synthetic patients every night and sends them through the latest version of our platform on there and looks at behaviour. And it's very easy to define, what does a successful diagnostic triage look like? Well, the right answer clinically, it's actually very easy to kind of check and score against. Once we're in a live patient environment, we don't do any real-time improvement loops, but what we do is we batch that data. So we'll say, okay, we can now take the last 1,000 patients that went through that, the last couple of weeks and look at outcomes, experience, or all the sort of variables that matter, and analyze that for, okay, what can we feed back into the system to make improvements? That improved system we then test iteratively with the synthetic data. And then once you've tested it against all of your safety tests, all of your kind of quality assurance, then you can release it into the patient environment where it's now a kind of improved higher performance system.
I'd love to, and I really want to make sure I don't forget to come back to how the patient interface is with how you manipulated a physiotherapist to be new robot, which is great. I forgot the name of what's the name of the
Kirsty.
Bless her.
Yeah. Which is her real name, by the way.
I know. You told me that.
Physiotherapist called
amazing, and will be, especially at the rate of proliferation of your service. It's going to be amazing how famous Kirsty is, and just how many people should be recognised when she's on her holidays. So I hope she's prepared for that fame. But before we do, I wondered if we could look a little bit at some of those assumptions over what you consider, because I like how definitive you are allowing yourself to, instead of a really relativistic model, which I often rail against in MSK, whereby people can't help themselves sometimes. They say, yeah, you like your pink tape and I like my rehab, and you like your needles and I like my blunt stuff, gets on my tits. So I love the fact that we're not in that space, but there are some assumptions that you are needing to make. Yeah. What do you consider to be MSK best practice for back pain? For those that haven't noticed yet, that is something that is Flok's primary model at the moment, is back pain care. So tell me about what you feel is that, because it's clear that if the assumptions were based on very specific manipulation and the right type of auricular acupuncture is best practice MSK care, then you're not delivering that. So what is it you feel, and what have you engaged your service in that you consider best practice?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, again, as you say, that there will always be subjectivity in MSK. If you put 100 physios in a room and ask them the same, give them the same patient case study, they all have a slightly different view of what they would do in management. So I think the key is like, what are the core principles that are known to be best practice, and then probably your 6 or 7 slight variants on that particular intervention are not going to be super critical. So the core principles for us in spine pathway is, I think there is really strong evidence going back a long time now that this is not a pathway that benefits from, for the vast majority of patients, from some sort of kind of hands-on or manual therapy. The gold standard in spine management for the vast majority of patients is going to be a personalized mix of exercise prescription, so movement, not just movements themselves, but also increased movement confidence and understanding, combined with sort of non-physical interventions around behavioral change coaching, the sort of psychosocial components, pain management techniques, so things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We're a spinal service currently expanding, which we can happy to talk about, but our kind of core service is the spinal service. The vast majority of our patients have long, complex, chronic histories of pain. And so, that kind of multidisciplinary, physical, non-physical education, advice, understanding, shifting beliefs over time, I think has to be a core part of it, alongside personalized exercise prescription. I think the other key bit in MSK, obviously, is that no intervention is good if a patient doesn't engage with it. Doesn't matter how good, if you can give me a 100 pieces of fantastic literature that this one movement would cure everyone's spinal pain, but no one will do it, then it doesn't matter. And so the other key bit for us is that we are really interested in the sort of behavioral psychology of engagement with treatment. How do you build it? How do you maintain it? And I think that a key piece there is actually explainability. And so we put a lot of effort in the system into ensuring that, again, like, you can build a super smart piece of tech that can pull in a bunch of data and say, like, for this patient, these are the 5 things that are most likely statistically to help them improve. If the patient doesn't believe that or can't understand why, and they feel like they've been given 5 random things, they're probably not going to do them, and they're not going to buy in. And so a key piece for us is you can't just pick the interventions. You have to be able to explain to the patient in the right kind of detail why for them is this, and and where's their uncertainty, where's their confidence, how might it change over time, and these things all take time to do, obviously. I think, that for us, that's key as well. It's not just what are the interventions, but it's how you're delivering them, which maybe actually leads us on to the interaction model piece.
It does, yeah. I mean, I have some. It's great, because I think it'd be unfair for me to not have some questions in some of the specifics with regards to the care model assumptions. But I want to get onto that. I think that it's tailored reassurance and graded exposure rehabilitation that makes sense as to how that could be delivered virtually anyway. So I think people do understand that that's the model. But the delivery interface surprised and pleased me, and that was a really clever way in which you've done that, because and people can't help themselves because they're becoming more familiar with something like ChatGPT, and it's verbal, and you can imagine even visual iterations. It just feels like service by chatbot is what you were being lumped in with. So tell me instead about how yours works.
Yeah, so the interaction model is really important. Again, if you've got the right answer, but the patient doesn't want to listen to it, it's not the right answer anymore. And so interaction model is really important. Again, I think when people hear about us, they typically assume one of two different interfaces, either a chatbot or some sort of like horrible avatar robot type experience. We are neither. It's probably the important thing to say up front. Right. On the chatbot front, I think this has become the standard interface for most consumer AI. It's a good interface with an LLM. I think it will evolve over time. It's not a good interface for care delivery, in my view. It doesn't capture. There's a reason that we've never really developed this as an interaction between clinician and patient, sort of like purely typed conversational input. In physio, it's obviously even less appropriate, less effective, because you've got all the physical components of movement. And if you're trying to, take someone through a movement assessment or demonstrate the right way of doing something, chatbot's a pretty horrible interface for trying to set off on that route. The other thing, to be honest, psychologically about chatbots is, I think, generally people just don't like them. I mean, the reality is most of the time, it's maybe changing a bit now, but most of the time you've interfaced with a chatbot, it's, trying to get customer support for your bank, or, trying to return something where it just keeps sending you in the same loop with some like awful sort of decision tree based chatbot. And it's not an interface that builds credibility and trust and rapport and actually a sense of emotional connection, which brings out
the worst in you as well, doesn't it?
It does.
You could imagine a circumstance where done badly, that would only worsen symptoms as a means of tension.
Yeah.
Like it's that annoying, and it brings out a more blunt and it discourages your own humanity.
It's not human. It's not human, and care is a fundamental part of care is feeling human. And being, feeling like you're being treated as a human as well, and text popping up on a screen doesn't make most people feel that seen as a person. Right. So what we did is we are recreating the experience of a video call. So as much as possible, we're sort of mimicking the physical world, right? Like if we're not going to like put a physical presence in the room with a patient, to do a sort of face-to-face AI consultation. But the closest thing we can do to that is to essentially recreate the experience that you'd have if your physiotherapy appointment was a video call with your physio, and they could kind of, and you could have that sort of deeper level of interaction. And, there's something just much more expressive about being able to, I mean, we could be doing this over the phone. We're not, because even though we can't be in the same room, it's more of a conversation because we can see each other and we've got all the nonverbal stuff as well. So we recreate that experience, and we do it not with some sort of like avatar or, again, it's these things don't, they sort of, there's this like uncanny valley effect where that just doesn't feel, it looks kind of impressive technically, but it doesn't feel emotionally correct normally. And so what we do is we manipulate real video footage in real time of a real physiotherapist, real human physiotherapist called Kirsty. So we have a large database of lots of very, very short, sequences of frames of Kirsty doing and saying various things and moving in particular ways. And then we have built a system that in real time, as the patient is responding, manipulates those clips, like assembles, stitches together, changes the order, mixes and matches things so that essentially she can respond in a way that is pretty seamless and feels very conversational, but is genuinely recreating a kind of human video call interaction. And so what patients see when they come through the service is their appointments are that video call interaction. They'll do an initial sort of triage diagnostic assessment type experience where should be taking a history, screening for all red flags, and obviously what all the questions depend on what the patient has reported so far, so kind of very dynamic. And then if there's kind of concern around pathology, they go off on a slightly different pathway. But for patients, the vast majority who are cleared for treatment, they then have a weekly video call in that AI model with Kirsty, where they'll do movement assessment, get treatment interventions, sort of around half an hour appointment a week for most patients. But obviously depends on what happens during it. And then alongside that, they can also contact our human physios at any point. So there's this voice messaging feature in the app. They can send a voice note to one of the physios asking if there's a question or they're looking for a bit of support or reassurance around something. They can send that in. One of the team will pick it up and get back to them.
Yes, gotcha. No, thanks for that. Now, I consented you for half an hour. Do you have another 15?
Yeah.
Are you good to go till, if we go till 11 or something like that?
Yeah. No, I can overrun. Yeah.
Superb. No, thank you. So I just want to bring us on to then outcomes, particularly over some of the ways in which that then did rightly penetrate into the mainstream media. So people might have seen that there's this, for those that are listening to us in their pockets, then you might want to have a little look at this. Is a BBC News article. AI Physio app halves waitlist for back pain treatment. And that did two things, really. One was it went fairly viral across various different circles, including mainstream, but also did then spook a few of you guys. And we're in touch. I don't think around those weeks, we were sent that as being, what do you think of this? As well as, why aren't you talking about this? Why didn't you give us a heads up about this? Which was also interesting at the time. I was sat on on council at CSP as well. So I had these various different things through my Physio Matters, occasionally patients as well in clinic. What do you think of this? They know I'm outspoken, even my locals. But I wondered if we can, before we go into those reactions, I wondered if you could just speak to the outcomes that you're referring to, because one of the things that's important to this and important to your story is that you've proven it works, and that's one of the things that inspires some of the strong reactions. But tell us about those outcomes, and tell us about why you feel it's become effective.
Yeah, so outcomes wise, I mean, the headline you flashed up was from our service across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, which was the first sort of large scale deployment in England. And large scale deployment gives you the sort of overall service impact metrics. We'd done earlier work that was sort of smaller scoped in pilots and things where you can extrapolate things out. But this was the first time working in partnership with Trust that we had run this across an entire region and seen the overall impact. And the overall impact was really substantial. And so, obviously patients using our service, opting in to use our service, will have a 0-day waiting list. It's kind of immediate access to assessment, triage, and treatment. And so crucially, the majority. So this is offered to we're now. So that was our kind of first large scale deployment. That was probably about 8-9 months old. That article, I think. We're now across 11 areas in the NHS, so it's growing quite quickly. And this is offered as a choice to back pain patients coming through for care, where they can choose to opt into digital in place of the face-to-face pathway. And different patients make different choices, but at the moment, the majority, so about 68%, choose Flok in place of going onto the waiting list for face-to-face care. There's a bunch of drivers there. It's speed of access. It's the fact that we do 24/7 appointments. It's the fact that you can kind of have more appointments, more contacts with the service, more kind of forms of support. But obviously, if you've got a service where the majority of spine patients aged 18 to 75 are choosing this service and are then being fully managed by it and not needing resource in the trust. So we refer back in less than 2% of patients for face-to-face. So the vast majority of people who opt in are being fully managed by the digital clinic, that mix of AI Physio plus our human telehealth support. And if, that means that, actually that's a fairly substantial proportion of the volume that was on, leading to backlogs and capacity strain in the trust. So in terms of trust level impacts, more than halved the waiting time across that service, which is quite a large region, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, 55% reduction in spinal weights, crucially 44% reduction in all MSK. And that's a mix of, spine, obviously a big component of MSK, but also you're freeing up, so that by treating those spine patients, we freed up 856 hours of clinician time per month in the trust. who were then able to see, the shoulders, the knees, the hips sooner, more frequently, offer more follow-up than they otherwise would have done. And so that's why you're getting that overall really substantial reduction in MSK. For patients, the outcomes are great. So MSK-HQ average improvement of 6.16, above kind of clinical and statistically significant thresholds. Proms and prems are fantastic. So over 80% of patients saying that the experience is equivalent or better than what they would expect face-to-face. Majority sees symptom improvement, which in a kind of predominantly chronic spinal population is obviously not always the easiest thing to do. Those are sort of headline outcomes. Obviously, this is an NHS setting as well, and so cost matters. And this is a more cost-efficient way of delivering those care pathways. So sort of per pathway, roughly 3 times less expensive for the trust, where we are managing that pathway than if they were to do it themselves in a face-to-face setting.
So we first meet about a few months ago at an MSKPN event, and because I'm a cantankerous prick, my first question to you in front of a small audience was, if you're calling yourself AI physiotherapy, I assume you've defined physiotherapy. What definition of physiotherapy are you using? Now, I'll preempt what you answered then, because I assume it's the same now, is that, well, no, I don't accept your premise on that. I would not have to define physiotherapy to use it. But my point, and where I want to start us off, rather than just rehash that brief back and forth, is that I feel increasingly a fan of your work and a fan of the service, especially the more I get to know it. However, it's an AI back pain service. It's an AI MSK service. The bit that seems to still bother me, and I'm working my way through it, and you might help me again today, is that I think you're calling it a physiotherapy service because that's the most ubiquitous cultural term that people recognize for it. And I think I understand the marketing of it, but I think that some of the disruption and some of the concerns that my colleagues have is that what is it about it that then means you think it's physiotherapy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a really interesting question. Firstly, I think it is physiotherapy. The interventions we're delivering, the treatment pathway, the care that our patients are getting is physiotherapy designed by physiotherapists. And every time they dial into an AI call with their, for their treatment session, they are seeing, real time assembled, yes, but video footage of an HCPC registered physiotherapist. So sort of across the board for me, if that isn't physiotherapy, kind of what is?
But I suppose physiotherapy is a profession, isn't it? It's not an intervention. Like Kirsty would not have passed her bachelor's in physiotherapy because she literally can't see neuro patients on a ward. So that's what's interesting is because I'm not doing this to be pedantic. I'm doing it as a means of if physiotherapists, including people like myself who can be a gobshite on the internet, don't gatekeep what it means to be physiotherapy, including as a regulatory protected title, then these are the sorts of questions. Because I understand what you're meaning there, but it's just that it's not, because physiotherapy, much like medicine, these are big catch-all terms. And to my point about Kirsty not passing her exams, do you see what I mean about where are the thresholds then?
Yes and no. Firstly, maybe we'll just cover the regulatory points. I think that's sort of fairly fast to cover. Physiotherapist is a protected term. We went through this discussion with the CSP. They included the HCPC. It's very clear from a kind of legal regulatory perspective that what we are defining is correct and permitted. There's sort of no. There was a debate at the time. There was a conversation to be had, and we had a view on why we thought it was appropriate. Everyone is now aligned that from a kind of legal regulatory perspective, this is a absolutely legitimate use of that terminology. So the question then becomes really, well, why do we want to use it? I think it's probably the subtext.
Also, there's somewhere in between. Totally agree with you on the legal side, definitely. But there's an ethical middle ground. It's not just about the suspicion of why you'd want to use it as much as it's that physiotherapy meets physiotherapist being the delineation. Some would argue is just a loophole of a sorts, right? Both
is acceptable use. As in, we allowed. It's both physiotherapists delivering physiotherapy.
But I definitely don't think with the time. I don't think it'd be very interesting for us to get into the details there. But so where you were going next was your want of use of the term. Let's carry on with that.
I think that the key thing here, and if I can be really blunt, I think the sort of conversation around what I think is asking the wrong question. I think it's worrying about the wrong piece and sort of having the wrong discussion. For me, the reason, like the critical thing here is like what we all want is for patients to get great care and get better, right? And not to basically confuse and overcomplicate a field of treatment management for a group of people who ultimately just want help with their pain. And I think, for me, the key thing here is like we've got to be clear with patients. We've got to make sure that they have good, clear expectations about what they're going to receive, and what they're going to receive is physiotherapy management. It's not a different form of management. Like, that's what they're going to get. Yeah. And being clear about that, I think, is helpful. I think the sort of, maybe if just sort of permit the detour, I'll try and make it quick. I think the sort of worry around this is, I think the kind of example I use, or the thing that I think people should be looking at, is probably the specialty of radiology. That radiology was the earliest clinical specialty to get heavily penetrated by AI. This is years ago, and you've got all the
CT head interpretation was bettered by robots long ago.
And you had some very, very intelligent people saying we should stop training radiologists. We're not going to need them anymore 10 years ago. Right. And if you look at radiology today, there is more demand for radiologists than there has ever been. There are more radiologists than there have ever been. And actually, the scope of the practice, it has had AI is very widely adopted in radiology. The reality of healthcare is super elastic. Like the limits on what you do day to day as a professional are mostly because you just don't have enough time, rather than because there isn't more you could do. And what AI has done in radiology has meant, sure, now like a bunch of scan interpretation, whether it's the only interpretation or the initial interpretation, is now done by AI systems. And that means that radiologists now do far more, frankly, often more interesting work as well, certainly more complex work. The expansion of the interventional radiology field has been enormous.
Beyond
it's elevated the profession.
It has. No, I love that. And I think it was really appropriate detail. But I think also what's interesting is, and it speaks to potentially a further conversation between us, or a further way in which we need to think about this more carefully, is that has happened, but also the radiologists can't help but lean in, especially in MSK. I've got interventional radiologists wanting to do jabs they shouldn't be doing because they want to lean into the more human side of it. So they're obsessed with, suddenly we're harking back to the dark days of sports medicine, wanting to do injections into joints they maybe shouldn't because they're being a bit hasty, right? It's been quite interventionally medical. And so I won't go down too far down that track, because I think it's such a good example of how, you're right, it can adapt, we should adapt, we will adapt. I do agree with that. Yeah. I think there is some unintended consequences there, and the professional conversation about professional development and the way in which we therefore do aspire to best practice needs to be had in such ways. But before we end up needing to go, can you just give me a bit of a clue then as to how you see Flok developing, especially with your intentions and future plans? For example, is this something that therefore core chronic back pain product or being more expansive across the country, or is it that therefore there are avenues into these? Do you want to be a complete MSK service? What's your intentions?
Yeah, so absolutely, we're expanding. I mean, our operational pathways at the moment are in spine. We've got currently hips, knees, and pelvic health services in development. So we'll launch all of those. Will launch this year. We will expect. Our focus is on particularly the high volume pathways in MSK, and being able to manage a high proportion of patients in those pathways with a high degree of autonomy to free up face-to-face capacity. We will also then start moving beyond physiotherapy. Our ultimate ambition is, actually, we think if you look at community population health more broadly, a large amount of the debilitation and downstream impact of poor health in a population is driven by this supply-demand gap. And it's saying, there are a bunch of areas where to improve healthcare outcomes, we need to go and do some very fundamental biological research, new cancer drugs. Actually, a lot, and it's great, a lot of that work happens and actually tends to be very well funded. A lot of the debilitation and impact in our population driven by poor health outcomes is actually driven by conditions that are well understood, but where care is not deliverable at the scale it is required. Yeah. And that isn't, and I think for me, there's, I think all of this debate around what's the impact on the profession, what's the impact on we should have all that debate. It's super important. And I think there's a very positive trajectory on it. So, that will of course be my view, but I think it is the case. Sort of, there's part of me that thinks, regardless of your view on this, we owe it to patients. There is a reality today that a large number of people unnecessarily suffer from poor health because of conditions that, as a clinical, the clinical field is entirely known how to manage that condition. And if you could put that patient in a room with a great clinician, they would no longer unnecessarily suffer or unnecessarily have a shortened lifespan, certainly a shortened quality, kind of health span. The fundamental reality is we cannot put all of those people in a room with a world-class clinician. There just is never going to be the workforce. And this is not something that, look at the demographics of our population across the entire Western world. Like, this is not something that's going to change anytime soon. In fact, the demographic pressure is just going up and up. Most trusts in the NHS are seeing about a 7% annual increase in demand for MSK every year. The largest increase in the number of physiotherapists in the UK that there has ever been in a year is about 2%. So even if we were to sort of maximally focus on training more clinicians, deploy more clinicians, which I absolutely think we should do, by the way, and we'll need to, we need to try and do regardless, that will not even keep pace with the increase in demand. And that doesn't account for the fact that today there are about 400,000 people on waiting lists for MSK in England, most of whom will wait about 16 weeks with a chronic pain definition of pain for more than 12 weeks. No one goes into practice to deliver that kind of care. And I think if we need, our goal is to sort of try and, obviously we want to be part of sort of facilitating that shift and ensuring that those patients actually can get care sooner, that more patients get the care they need, whether or not that's with service like us or in face-to-face. Ultimately, it all feeds together. I think as a domain, as a profession, actually the important thing is stepping back and seeing that bigger picture and saying, actually, that is, everyone goes into clinical practice because they want to be able to help. They want people to get the best care and get better. And and I think it's hard to look at most of the current systems in play today and say, like, we're achieving all our goals here. We're winning this. And we need to, so we do need, I think we need to lean into this stuff. We need to embrace it. We need to do it in the right way. We need to have the right conversations. But ultimately, this is about ensuring that patients get the best care.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And also, for more conversations I have with you, the more I look into you guys, the more I recognise that is your heart is in the right place with that. And I always say, does the proliferation of this service or technology improve care standards for those suffering with pain and injury? It's my North Star. Now, I really do increasingly confidently feel it is the case with you guys. I think one of the things that's interesting, I'm more speaking to the gallery a bit here now, Finn, so forgive me as we wrap up, but there'll be those of ours, particularly our more transient audience, but our core audience will be unsurprised by my line of questioning, or maybe where I haven't gone. If when we were talking about best practice care and you feel the facilitation of movement by way of interventional means, be that acupuncture, taping, manual therapies for persistent back pain, you feel that is so central to it and that hands-on element is something that you feel is the je ne sais quoi that makes good therapy. I on this, even as devil's advocate, I can't be your champion today. Right, I am a functional rehab guy. It's well known. It doesn't mean that I'm disparaging of those things, but it also means that when I understand what Flok is aiming for, especially at this moment in time, and I look at that demographic and I look at its outcomes, I am heartened at the fact that it is sampling properly. And I'm also recognising the way in which that means that there's plenty of room for people like myself in practice, seeing people on a daily basis with those same issues and concerns. But as a means of triage, we can do better. I am not threatened by it, nor should you be. The second part is, there is a clumsiness that sometimes occurs, including overlapping with our audience, where you can't help but think it's an us or them, us versus the robots, or that, well, you should train and pay better. And that's a political question that therefore is being disrupted and it is only on the downside of a ledger with regards to technology. I don't agree. I look forward to these debates. I want to have you on the show for anyone else that wants to come and challenge me on that, because I'm inevitably wrong, but I'm wrong by accident. And these sorts of things and these sorts of conversations, including with technologists that are lending themselves into the MSK industry, for me is all for the good and is exciting and is something that we need to embrace. And I want to just thank you, Finn, for being part of that conversation, for including this one. It's been a long time coming. We've been meaning to get this together, and I'm glad we have. I wish you all well, and let's keep in touch. And for those that want to just find out a little bit more about you, how do they do so?
So do get in touch. You can get in touch via our website. If you want to get in touch with me personally, my email's finn@flok.health. Very happy. You know, this is the kind of conversation I love having. So I really appreciate you having me on, Jack. And you know, it's a space I'm enormously passionate about, and you know, I'm devoting my my entire career to. I love having a conversation with other people who are, you know, who care equally about it, and you know, even if we disagree on how to get there, I think actually that's really important. You've got those discussions are helpful. Like you end up often with you know, with a new perspective, new information. You know, I think that's fantastic. I think we should do, you know, this broader space should do as much of this kind of discussion as possible. And certainly, you know, regardless of your view, you know, I think you've said it well, like a lot of this is happening, and you know, we've got to engage with it. You know, it is important to engage. You know, we really want to have that. You know, we do a lot of interaction with the CSP. Obviously, you know, it's really important for us. We want this to be a holistic conversation with everyone involved, because that matters. And you know, and I think don't, you know, if you're listening thinking, well, I disagree with, you know, I think this is. I'd encourage you do disagree, but come and disagree.
Absolutely.
Don't stick your head in the sand, because a lot of this is going to happen. It's too important not to, in my view, and you know, the results are too good at the moment for there not to be. You know, we are seeing rapid adoption in the NHS because the results are so good, and because it aligns with priorities. So do be part of the conversation. You know, I think that's super important, and I'm extremely positive about. You know, I think we part of our goal is to elevate physiotherapy as a profession. I think we will achieve that.
And I can see that, that's certainly part of your mission. So again, thank you and congratulations on what you're up to so far. And thank you all. For those that want to get in touch with us directly, of course, our social media channels are open to you. Log into your accounts if you're a member, but also info@physio-matters.com for anything you like, including anything anonymously. And Finn's been brave enough to give you his email address as well, and so please do use that. And I really do trust what he says there, where he says he's open to these conversations, as he's proving coming into the Lions Den today. So thank you so much, Finn, and we'll speak again, mate.
Thanks, Jack. Great to see you. Cheers.